first it was such a quiet thing. I did not notice it, but now I wonder if it has always been there. I merely could not hear it before. The sound builds so slowly, yet when you listen for it, you can make out the strains, even over the background life of the universe. Do you feel it as if you are the darkness in which all life dies, my lord? All life exists to feed your power, and my life is yours. I beg you, please, let me die. Yes, this disturbance echoes through the force. I can follow it to its source and bring it to you. I will leave it once, my lord.
So there we have those two characters. That was their first introduction in the game. A lot of elements went into constructing Darth Nihilus, thanks to the Kenner Corporation. He started out initially during our initial story drafts as very much of a B character. We also never called him Darth Nihilus in the game because, quite frankly, having anyone say that name out loud, it just sounds incredibly stupid. What we wanted to do was sort of give Darth Nihilus the feeling of being a very nebulous figure. And we thought that that would end up making him much more of an evil presence and much more reflective of the dark side of the Force than an actual living person. Interestingly enough, this portrayal of the character caused a lot of arguments and back and forth with our marketing folks. And the reason for that was whenever we got pictures back of like ads or like covers that they wanted to do involving Darth Nihilus, because he was reflective, sort of like the face of the game, like Darth Maul was. They would always try and add this little feature, which you can see on the actual action figure. They'd actually try and add the silhouette of a nose past the mask. And I would continually go back and go, you know what? You have to strip all hint of facial features past that mask. The player or anyone seeing that mask can't be reminded that there's anything beyond that, because that kills the whole nebulous vibe that we're trying to create with this character. And even so, the arguments persisted, and there were quite a number of ads that came out where Darth Nihilus actually looked like a scrawny guy behind the cape and the mask, and it made me very, very, very sad. Also, another thing we liked about Darth Nihilus, including his speech patterns, was that the more nebulous you make the figure and the more open to interpretation, the more you allow the player character to fill in the blanks for the mystery of what's going on behind that character. We did have several answers about Darth Nihilus's background and origins, but ultimately by portraying him as this force that's basically represented just through that mask, we wanted the player to sort of contribute their own evilness to that character as well. So, Darth Nihilus started with a concept. The fine figure here you see on the slide is our concept artist, Brian Menzie, who is responsible for many of the character designs and concepts, both at Black Isle Studios and at Obsidian. The goal with Nihilus, obviously, is to make him more feel like a void in the Force. His primary Force technique in the game is that he is hungry all the time, much like I am when I'm on a very heavy workout regimen. Darth Nihilus, his Sith technique is that he can feed on other Force sensitives in the Star Wars universe and can consume them like a vampire. Another reason we chose the living black hole, the sort of unceasing hunger, was because that Darth Nihilus was directly spawned from that tragedy that the player created, which also had reflections in that hunger and that sort of void-like effect that actually was part of that tragedy that occurred. Also, in discussions with Brian, Brian very much wanted Darth Nihilus to look like death coming for the player, for the death the player should have died at the end of the Mandalorian Wars and didn't. So very much the skull motif that you see with the mask was intended to reflect that as well, with the silhouette of black around it. The skull would be the only thing the player would see. So in transitioning from that figure of death, from that skull-like image, Brian actually went back to the James Bond roots, and this was actually even before we started doing Alpha Protocol, so it was kind of amusing. He started examining various villains that had been in place in the cinema and looking for similar designs involving that death-like motif. From there, once he'd chosen a specific James Bond villain that he actually thought had a very good character concept with the face paint, he transitioned that into trying to translate that face paint into much more of an African mask style. Since he realized that part of the development of cultures in the Star Wars universe is very much upon drawing from real world cultures and then leveraging that in the science fiction genre. Also, the mask ended up being the focus because we wanted that mask to really be the only physical thing about Darth Nihilus. It was essentially his only real anchor to the world of the Star Wars universe. His hunger and his quest for murdering other Force sensitives was the only thing that actually kept him on his plane and from just perishing entirely. That transition of the idea of him as this sort of walking void was also extended to his actual robe and silhouette design as well. Brian very much wanted the hood of Darth Nihilus's outfit to be much different than the Jedi cowl, so that when you saw him in silhouette, you would instantly recognize him as being a different figure than the other characters in the game. Also, if our programmers had found a way to coax this out of the engine using their talents, one of the things we wanted to do was actually sort of create also a nebulous haze around Darth Nihilus as well, to sort of help reflect that sort of ethereal nature about him. Another motivation beyond creating Darth Nihilus the way we did was we also had another adversary in the game who was very much like Darth Maul. And he was very much more of a physically minded Sith Lord in the sense of how he fought, how he acted, and how he communicated with the player. So Darth Nihilus also was sort of the yin to his yang. So how do we go about building cinematic sequences like the one between Visas and Nihilus? Well, we start with a core idea. We realize that for what we needed for that scene is that we had to introduce Darth Nihilus for the first time. We also had to introduce Visas Mar, who was his apprentice. And we had to make sure that the player understood from a foreshadowing standpoint exactly what the relationship was between those two characters. And that ended up being important because Visas Mar is one of the companions you can potentially recruit in the game. So So the dual challenge was we had to make her evil, or in service to evil, but at the same time also make her a sympathetic character, so the player would potentially hesitate before landing the killing stroke when fighting her for the first time. For all our cinematic sequences that we do at Obsidian and Black Isle, we also have a series of style guides that we do in terms of how we want the characters to walk, how we want them to react to things, and also what the relationship is to the player character. And those style guides can take a lot of different forms. Ultimately, this is done because we usually have multiple designers and multiple writers on any one project, and having all the rules and themes laid out in documentation so that everyone knows like how many responses a player character should give, what are appropriate dark side responses, when companions are supposed to interject, All of those elements, we try and define that as much as possible before people actually start writing these characters. And that helps give them a series of bookends for their actual design abilities.